He thought calling her out in front of everyone would make him look powerful, but he had no idea he was about to hand her the entire room. The auditorium lights glowed cold against polished floors as conversations buzzed, a low hum of confidence and ego filling every seat. And right there near the back wall stood Naomi Carter, quiet as always, blending into the edges like she'd trained herself to disappear, her simple black sweater and worn sneakers making her invisible in a room full of tailored suits and polished smiles. And yet somehow she was always there when something needed fixing, organizing, adjusting, but never noticed. Long enough to be remembered, and definitely never respected, especially not by Ethan Brooks, the man who commanded attention the moment he spoke, his voice sharp, measured, practiced for rooms like this, the kind of man who didn't just lead conversations but controlled them. And tonight, he was in his element, pacing slowly across the stage with that confident half-smile, scanning faces like he owned every second of their attention, until his eyes landed on her, and something in his expression shifted, not curiosity, not respect, just amusement, like he'd just spotted an opportunity. And that was when he said it, casual enough to sound harmless, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You in the back, you've been standing there all night. Why don't you come up and contribute something?" And just like that, the energy in the room tilted, heads turning, whispers forming, a few quiet laughs slipping out as phones subtly lifted. Because everyone understood what this was, it wasn't an invitation, it was a setup, and Naomi felt it immediately. The weight of 100 eyes pressing in, the expectation, the judgment already written before she even moved. And for a moment she stayed still, fingers loosely clasped, gaze lowered, exactly who they believed she was. Just another quiet girl who didn't belong in rooms like this. And somewhere near the front, someone muttered under their breath, "This should be interesting," followed by a soft chuckle, but then something almost invisible happened, so subtle most people missed it. Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders straightening just a fraction, her eyes lifting, not wide, not nervous, just steady. And in that single breath, the silence around her shifted ever so slightly, like the room itself was about to learn something it wasn't prepared for. The moment stretched just long enough for the room to grow uncomfortable, not because anyone felt sympathy, but because they were waiting for her to fail. And that kind of anticipation had its own rhythm, slow and sharp, like a held breath that refused to release. And Naomi could feel every second of it pressing against her, the quiet girl suddenly at the center of something she had spent years avoiding. Yet her expression did not crack, not even slightly, because this was not new to her, not really. The whispers, the assumptions, the way people decided who you were before you ever spoke. She had learned to live inside that silence, to observe it, to understand it, and more importantly, to control what she revealed within it. While across the stage Ethan Brooks leaned casually against the podium, watching her with that same half-smile, the kind that suggested he had already predicted the outcome, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood as if counting down to the moment she would stumble, and the audience followed his lead, their attention shifting from curiosity to expectation. A few more phones rising discreetly, someone in the second row whispering, "She is not going to say anything," followed by a quiet laugh that rippled just enough to spread. But Naomi did not rush. She did not defend herself. She did not even glance at the crowd. Instead, she took a single step forward, slow, deliberate, the sound of her sneakers against the polished floor somehow louder than it should have been. And that small sound cut through the room like a signal, because it was the first time anyone realized she was actually going to move. And suddenly the amusement began to thin, not disappear, but shift into something less certain. And Ethan straightened slightly, just a fraction, his posture adjusting as if he needed a clearer view, not because he was concerned, but because something about her pace did not match the narrative he had set. And Naomi continued, step by step, until she reached the edge of the stage, pausing only briefly before lifting her gaze again, this time not just steady but focused. And when she spoke, her voice was not loud, not dramatic, but clear enough to carry across every seat without effort. "You asked me to contribute," she said, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no apology, no trace of the uncertainty they expected, just calm precision. And that was when the room changed again, because it was no longer waiting for her to fail. It was beginning, slowly, to listen. The shift was subtle, But it was undeniable, because the moment Naomi finished that sentence, the room no longer felt like it belonged to Ethan Brooks. It felt suspended, like something important was about to unfold, and even those who had been smiling just seconds ago found themselves sitting a little straighter, not out of respect yet, but out of instinct, because confidence without noise has a way of demanding attention. And Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it settle, until every whisper had no place left to hide, and only then did she move, stepping fully onto the stage without asking for permission, without looking back, as if she had always known she would end up there, and that alone unsettled Ethan more than he expected, though he masked it quickly, clearing his throat with a short, controlled laugh as if to regain control of the moment. "Well then," he said, gesturing loosely toward the screen behind him, "why do you not show us something worth hearing?" His tone still carrying that edge of mockery, but thinner now, less certain, and Naomi turned slightly, her eyes scanning the presentation that had filled the evening. Charts, projections, polished ideas delivered with confidence, but lacking something deeper, something honest. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, but there was a quiet clarity in it that cut sharper than any raised tone. "You have been explaining this for the last 40 minutes, she said, not accusing, just stating, but you skipped the part where it actually works, and a ripple moved through the audience, not laughter this time, but confusion, curiosity, because that was not the kind of response they expected, and Ethan's smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her more carefully, as if trying to understand whether she was guessing or if she knew something he did not expect her to know. And Naomi stepped closer to the screen, reaching for the remote with steady hands, not asking, not hesitating. And when the slide changed, the room leaned in without realizing it, because something had shifted again, something deeper, and for the first time that night, it was not Ethan setting the pace, it was her, and no one, not even him, could quite interrupt it without breaking the fragile tension that now held the entire room in place. The new slide appeared, cleaner, simpler, stripped of the unnecessary layers that had filled the screen before, and Naomi stood just off to the side, not blocking it, not claiming it, but somehow making it entirely hers, her presence no longer quiet in the way they had assumed, but quiet in the way control often is, deliberate, measured, undeniable. And as she lifted the remote again, her movements remained precise, almost effortless, like someone who had done this not once, but 100 times, in rooms far more demanding than this one, and the audience felt it, that subtle realization settling in as eyes shifted from the screen back to her, then back again, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had believed just minutes ago, while Ethan remained still near the podium, his hand resting against the edge, his expression tightening not in anger, but in calculation, because something about this was no longer predictable, and unpredictability was not something he handled well in public, especially not in a room he had already claimed as his own. And Naomi finally spoke again, her tone steady, almost conversational, but carrying an authority that did not ask for agreement. "This is where your model breaks," she said, pointing lightly to a section most people had not even noticed before, and a murmur rippled across the audience, not dismissive this time, but engaged, because now they were not watching her fail, they were trying to understand her, and that shift was everything, because once curiosity replaces judgment, control begins to change hands, and Naomi continued without raising her voice, walking them through each step with clarity that cut through the complexity Ethan had spent nearly an hour building, simplifying what had seemed impressive into something flawed, something incomplete. And the more she spoke, the quieter the room became, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to miss the next word. And somewhere in the second row, a man who had been recording lowered his phone without realizing it, his attention fully captured, while Ethan finally stepped forward, his voice entering the space again, controlled but edged. "That is not entirely accurate," he said, attempting to reassert his ground. But Naomi did not interrupt him. She simply waited, allowing him to finish, and when he did, she met his gaze calmly, not challenging, not defensive, just certain. "Then show them," she replied softly, stepping back half a pace, offering him the floor he had lost. And that was when the tension sharpened, because for the first time that night, Ethan was no longer performing, He was being asked to prove something, and the room felt it instantly, the balance shifting, the control no longer his to command. And in that fragile silence, every eye turned back to him, waiting. For the first time that evening, Ethan did not answer immediately, and that pause, small as it was, echoed louder than anything he had said all night, because it broke the rhythm he had built so carefully, the rhythm of confidence, control, and certainty. And now that rhythm was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, doubt, not just in him, but in the minds of everyone watching, and Naomi did not rush to fill it. She stood still, hands relaxed at her sides, her presence no longer invisible but undeniable, as if the space itself had shifted to accommodate her. And every second that passed without Ethan speaking made the silence heavier, thicker, until even the faint hum of the lights above seemed too loud. And finally, he stepped forward, clearing his throat, his voice returning. With effort, "The model is complex," he said, gesturing toward the screen as if reclaiming it. "There are layers you are not accounting for." And a few heads in the audience nodded reflexively, clinging to familiarity, to the version of reality they had accepted earlier. But Naomi did not react to the tone. She only tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words with genuine attention. And then she moved again, one small step closer to the screen, pointing not broadly, not dramatically, but precisely to a single variable, this layer. She asked softly, and the question was not aggressive, not mocking, but it carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore, because it was not asked for the sake of argument. It was asked for the sake of truth. And Ethan's expression tightened, his eyes flickering briefly to the data, as if recalculating something in real time. And the audience noticed. They noticed everything now. The shift in his posture, the hesitation in his breathing, the way his confidence no longer filled the room the way it had before. And Naomi continued, her voice steady, almost gentle. "You adjusted it to compensate," she said. "But you never corrected the base assumption." And this time the reaction was immediate, a ripple of realization moving through the rows like a quiet wave, because suddenly the pieces began to connect, not because she was louder, but because she was clearer. And clarity has a way of exposing everything at once. And Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out right away. And that was the moment it became undeniable, the moment the room understood that this was no longer a demonstration, no longer a controlled performance. This was something real, something unscripted. And Naomi, the quiet girl they had laughed at, was not just participating anymore. She was leading, and as she stepped back slightly, giving him space once more, it was no longer a gesture of deference. It was a quiet challenge, one that did not need to be spoken, because everyone in that room could feel it. And for the first time that night, they were not looking at Ethan for answers. They were waiting to see if he had any at all. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to her. And that difference was something no one in the room could ignore anymore, because what had started as a moment of entertainment had transformed into something far more uncomfortable, a quiet unraveling of everything they thought they understood. And Ethan felt it more than anyone, the shift in attention, the subtle turning of heads, the way the room no longer leaned toward him for guidance, but held its breath for her next word. And for a man who had built his reputation on certainty, that loss of control was not just inconvenient, it was disorienting. And he tried to recover, drawing in a measured breath, straightening his posture, stepping forward as if reclaiming space could restore authority. "You are oversimplifying a very advanced framework," he said, his voice steady but no longer effortless. And Naomi listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her focus unbroken, as if his words were simply part of a process she had already accounted for. And when he finished, she did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply reached for the remote again, her movements calm, intentional. And with a single click, the screen shifted once more, revealing a stripped-down version of his model, clean, transparent, undeniable. And a quiet murmur spread through the audience. Not confusion this time, but recognition. Because now they could see it, not hidden behind layers of complexity, not disguised by confident delivery, but exposed for what it was, incomplete. And Naomi stepped slightly to the side, giving the audience a full view, not positioning herself as the center, but allowing the truth itself to take that role. If the foundation is wrong, she said softly. Everything built on it will fail. And there was no accusation in her tone, only clarity, and that clarity landed harder than any criticism could have, because it left no room for interpretation. And somewhere near the front row, a man who had been nodding along with Ethan earlier slowly lowered his gaze to the screen, his expression tightening as realization settled in, while Ethan remained still, his eyes fixed on the projection, searching, recalculating, but finding no easy way out, because the moment had already passed, the space where he could dismiss her, laugh it off, regain control. It was gone, replaced by something far more permanent, exposure. And Naomi did not press further. She did not need to, because the room was already doing the work for her, connecting the dots, shifting their understanding. And as she finally looked back at Ethan, her gaze steady and composed, it was no longer the look of someone asking to be heard. It was the look of someone who already had been. And in that stillness, the entire room understood something they would not forget. Power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits, quietly, until the moment it can no longer be ignored. No one spoke, and that silence was no longer fragile. It was absolute, the kind that settles in when something undeniable has just happened and no one wants to be the first to break it, because doing so would mean acknowledging it out loud. And Ethan stood there in the center of that silence, no longer the anchor of the room, but a man being quietly measured by it, his gaze fixed on the screen as if searching for a detail he could still control. But the more he looked, the clearer it became that there was nothing left to reclaim, and the audience could see it too, not in any dramatic gesture, not in a raised voice, but in the absence of one, in the way his confidence had thinned into something far less certain. And Naomi did not move to fill that space. She remained exactly where she was, composed, patient, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but held it effortlessly. And after a long moment, Ethan finally turned toward her, his expression no longer amused, no longer dismissive, but searching, as if trying to understand how he had misread her so completely. And when he spoke, his voice carried a weight it had not carried before. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. And it was not a challenge, not an attempt to regain control. It was a genuine question, quiet but exposed. And Naomi held his gaze for just a second before answering. "I have been here the whole time," she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, and the simplicity of that answer landed deeper than any explanation could have, because it forced everyone in the room to confront the same realization. She had not arrived out of nowhere. She had not suddenly become capable. She had always been this. They had just chosen not to see it, and a shift moved through the audience, subtle but powerful, heads lowering slightly, expressions tightening, not out of embarrassment alone but out of recognition, because the moment was no longer about a mistake in a model. It was about something much larger, something personal, and Naomi did not linger on it. She did not explain further. She simply stepped back, placing the remote down gently, as if closing something that had already been decided. And as she turned to leave the stage, no one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would not feel smaller than what had just occurred. And behind her, Ethan remained still, watching, not with frustration, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding settling in, the kind that does not come from being told, but from being shown. And in that moment, the room did not belong to him anymore. It followed her, even in silence. The sound of her footsteps was soft against the polished floor, but in that silence, it carried farther than anything said that night. And as Naomi moved toward the exit, something unexpected happened. Not applause, not noise, but movement, subtle at first, a shift in posture, a turning of heads, as if the entire room was quietly reorienting itself around her presence instead of the stage she had just left behind. And one by one, people who had been so certain just minutes ago began to feel the weight of their own assumptions, the quiet laughter, the dismissive glances, the way they had already decided who mattered before anything had even begun. And now those same faces held something different, not just surprise, but recognition, because what they had witnessed was not just skill, it was restraint, control, and a kind of confidence that did not need permission to exist. And near the front row, someone finally shifted in their seat, clearing their throat as if to say something, but no words came, because anything spoken would feel smaller than the moment itself, and Ethan remained exactly where he was, still facing the screen that no longer belonged to him, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. A man who had built his identity on being the one people listened to, now standing in a room that had already chosen someone else, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he turned his gaze toward the back, toward the door Naomi had nearly reached, and for a brief second, it looked like he might speak, might try to call her back, to reclaim something of what had been lost. But he did not, because some moments cannot be undone once they are understood, and instead, he lowered his eyes slightly, not in defeat, but in realization, and behind him, the audience followed that same quiet motion, not instructed, not coordinated, just instinctive, because respect, when it finally arrives, does not need to be announced. It shows itself in silence, and as Naomi reached the door and placed her hand on the handle, she paused just long enough to glance back, not at the crowd, not at the stage, but at the space itself, as if acknowledging something unseen, and then she stepped out, leaving behind a room that would not sound the same again, a room that had learned, in a single unguarded moment, that the people they overlook are often the ones who understand everything. And the silence she left behind did not fade. It stayed, lingering in the air like a truth no one could ignore. The door closed softly behind her, and yet the weight of her presence did not leave with her. It stayed, settling into the walls, into the chairs, into every person who had witnessed what had just unfolded. And for a long moment, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because they understood, finally, that something irreversible had just happened. Something that could not be explained away or reframed into something comfortable, and Ethan Brooks remained at the front, no longer trying to reclaim the stage, no longer searching for a way to restore what had been lost, because the truth had already taken its place, and it did not need him anymore. And slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped away from the screen, the same screen that had once carried his authority, now reduced to a silent reminder of what had been exposed. And as he looked out at the audience, he saw not admiration, not certainty, but reflection, people no longer looking at him for answers, but looking inward, questioning what they had missed, what they had ignored, and why. And somewhere near the back, one person finally stood, not to leave, but simply to breathe, as if the air itself had changed, and that small movement broke the stillness just enough for others to follow, not with noise, but with quiet understanding. And outside, beyond those doors, Naomi Carter walked down the hallway the same way she had always walked, steady, unhurried, unchanged in the way that mattered most, because nothing about her had shifted, only the way others had finally seen her. And that was the difference. That was always the difference. And inside that room, the lesson lingered. Long after she was gone, not spoken, not announced, but felt in the silence that remained. Because respect is not created in the moment someone proves themselves. It is revealed in the moment others realize they were wrong. And that night, no one said it out loud, but everyone carried it with them. The understanding that the quietest person in the room is not always the least powerful. Sometimes, they are simply waiting for the moment when the truth no